Let's start with a kind of bigger picture of Latin America, and in particularly the pink tide governments that I'll explain in a sec. So, around the turn of the century, the beginning of the 21st century, there was a crisis of neoliberalism in Latin America, and at the same time there was an absolutely inspiring rise in popular mobilisations. You'll be familiar with the countries we're talking about, in particular in Venezuela, in Bolivia and in Ecuador as well. An enormous level of mobilisation. And I would argue that for a while at least at that time, Latin America was, I think, the key battleground against neoliberalism and against capitalism in the whole world for a while. And the Washington Consensus was challenged by loads and loads of different groups, workers as such, by peasants, by slum dwellers, by especially indigenous people in some countries and so on and so forth. But in an enormous level of mobilisation. And a reflection of this was the election of a number of more or less left-wing governments. Now you can argue about which governments you include in the pink tides, but some were perceived as extremely radical, some frankly were extremely moderate social democrats in power. The Chavez regime in Venezuela was both an early example and a very, very important one. Now what these pink tide governments did, undoubtedly, was to improve the living standards, the conditions of many of the people who were mobilised. What they did not do, however, and I think this is a very important place to start, what they didn't do was challenge the process of capital accumulation. In other words, challenge the way that profits were made in the economy. And they didn't fundamentally change class relations and class power in those countries. Now, the situation of the pink tide governments, the way they were able to implement their welfare, their redistributive programs, was heavily dependent on a massive boom in the prices of the goods that they produced for the world market, particularly driven by the demand in the Chinese economy at the time, a massive focus from China on investment in Latin America, buying from Latin America, etc. And this enabled the left governments to to fund, if you like, the redistribution programs. Bless you. So, for example, there's a much higher level of direct investment in the economies. The pink tide governments are able to accumulate foreign reserves which they could use, and above all else they're able to sell their products. In Latin America we're talking about oil and gas, we're talking about mining, minerals and so on, and we're talking about agro-industrial products like soya, for example, sesame, etc., stuff that's grown for oil primarily. And all these had a boom in the world price in the first 10, even longer, first 10, 15 years of the century, 10, 12 years of the century, shall we say. Now these absolutely clearly brought material benefits to working people in all those countries, and they brought some reduction in inequality as well, although some of that is now being reversed. There's an Uruguayan economist called Eduardo Gardenias who describes it as the compensatory state. So the capitalist state still functions, but it's able to channel much more in terms of goods and services, etc., welfare, towards its working population. Now, at the same time as it was able to do that, both domestic and foreign capital in those countries was able to flourish. Operated normally in terms of relations between the foreign investment companies, oil companies, for example, in Venezuela and the Venezuelan government, and domestic capital was also able to prosper. David Harvey, by the way, points out that the phrase he uses for what's going on is extractive capitalism, if you think about the products made and the processes. And he also points out that there's a downside to it in the sense that he also says that this is capital accumulation by dispossession. So throughout the process, although we've got this kind of, if you like, beneficial aura towards working people, you've also got people, especially indigenous people in Latin America, who are severely affected by attacks on their lands, attacks on their rights as nations, etc., etc. Now that economic situation has changed completely in the last 7-8 years. The world recession of 2007 to 2008 came quite late actually to South America, a bit earlier to Central America and the Caribbean. But by about 2012, the effects of the world recession, particularly the dip in the Chinese economy, is being felt very, very much in South America. And austerity measures, as in the rest of the world, are being imposed. This is the response of capitalism and of the ruling class to the economic crisis. So export earnings obviously drop. Foreign direct investment, especially in mining, actually drops considerably, and above all, if you look at the prices for the commodities that these countries were selling, the fall in the prices is catastrophic. So when Chavez was alive, when Chavez was president of Venezuela, the oil price reached somewhere above $140 per barrel. At the moment it's 46. So you're looking at a decline in oil price, for example, of 2/3, which massively has an enormous effect. Of course it does. And what it means that political decisions on a class basis were taken by those left governments, and those affected worst, of course, were not the rich but the poor in those societies. At the same time, the right, in all those countries, you can think through, if you know the situations in them, Argentina, in Bolivia, in Ecuador, and especially, above all else, in Venezuela, the right has gone onto the offensive, both in terms of parliamentary elections, but also in terms of extra parliamentary activity, of disruption, of attempts to overturn governments, etc. And those austerity policies that have come in have both harmed and alienated parts of the popular movements in the pink tide countries. Now, it doesn't mean, I'm not arguing for a second that it's all over necessarily, although things have been going very badly for most of the pink tide governments electorally, and neither am I arguing that there will be an inevitable turn to the right. But what's quite clear is that the pink tide governments are under massive pressure, and in some cases, in the case of Venezuela, the situation is such that you can only describe it as a terrible, terrible crisis in Venezuelan society at the moment, of which more in a minute. Now, the relationship between those pink tide governments and the social and popular movements in the country was always equivocal. Right? What the pink tide governments did was reflect the power of mobilisation and struggles of people in those pink tide countries, but they didn't actually embody them. Right? So they're a reflection of the power of the resistance to neoliberalism. In the process of the last 15 years, particularly almost as soon as they were elected, many of the pink tide governments switched away from that sort of insurrection. It was insurrectionary in some countries, an insurrectionary movement towards parliamentary politics, and with that, towards a demobilising of the popular movement, what Jeff Webber describes as a moderation of strategic horizons. The idea of a revolution became much more contained inside the constitutional process. The element of self-assertion and popular control was eroded. Weber talks about a shift from talking about 21st century socialism, you remember Chavez, to rather a neo-developmental model within the restrictive bounds of capitalism. Popular approval ratings for the left governments were very, very high, sometimes ridiculously high, into the 80%. When Chavez wins some of the elections, you're talking about 65, 70% of the vote. These have now fallen considerably, above all as a result of the worsening economic situation, but also as a result of the political demobilisation, and also in some cases, we have to be honest about this, the political repression of popular forces. This has been the case in Bolivia, for example, with indigenous people in the east of the country. If you look at Ecuador, almost the whole of the indigenous people's movement is alienated from País, from Correa's movement, because they have been attacked by the government. Now, I think it's useful, I think, to try and get a kind of theoretical framework as well as a description of events and an analysis of events. And I want to draw your attention to several commentators who have used a model that's based on Gramsci and what Gramsci calls passive revolution. And the way it's described is it's a mixture of two tendencies that are operating inside this process. So on the one hand, there's a revolutionary transformative dynamic that takes place, particularly when there are large numbers of people mobilised. And on the other hand, there's also a conservative restorative one that ensures that the process doesn't go beyond the bounds of capitalism, doesn't go beyond the bounds sometimes of constitutional politics, etc. So the old order is not completely restored, there are real changes, but on the other hand, neither is there a revolutionary change in class relations in society, in the way the economy works and so on. Adam Morton describes it as a revolutionary form of political transformation that's pressed into a conservative process of restoration. Now, Morton's talking about 20th century Mexico. There's a very careful model of how that Gramscian analysis works on Bolivia by a guy called Luis Tapia, who's now a left-wing critic of the Morales government, a sort of leading Marxist in Bolivia. More interestingly, there's a Mexican-Italian analyst called Massimo Modonese, who tries to present a model of this passive revolution analysis that looks at the whole of the left governments, as I'm trying to do in the introduction. And he suggests that there's a 5-point process that describes what's going on. So first of all, the left governments promote a development model that kind of oscillates between substantial reform, and there is some substantial reform, and a modest conservatism, but it's essentially within the bounds of a neoliberal framework. Secondly, change is carried out by sections of the dominant classes and the state from above. Sometimes it incorporates some of the popular forces that rose up against neoliberalism, but the limits of change are clearly set by the bourgeois state and by private property rights and the law on them. Thirdly, the popular movements are often absorbed, co-opted, sometimes repressed by those forces that are making the changes of government, the new forces, and that's often been achieved through distribution and clientistic arrangements. So if you look at Ecuador, for example, you can model the current base of support for the Correa project almost exactly to where the aid went from the earthquake in Ecuador. There's one particular province, Manabí, which has no tradition of radicalism at all, which voted highest for the Correa government. It's also where the aid. So those sort of clientistic arrangements are quite common. The new political configurations, the different left parties and governments, have taken advantage of the demobilisation or pacification to gain a much higher level of control over the popular movement than there was during the early years of the century. And finally, there's often a reliance on a charismatic leader. And clearly, Chavez is the best example, but Evo Morales has very consciously, I think, kind of cultivated a personality cult around himself. That reinforces the pacification of social forces, of insurrectionary social forces, and increases the delegative aspects, the idea that things are done for you from above rather than by yourself from below. Now there's one addition to that model, which is from Jeff Webber, who I think is probably the best writer on the whole process of the pink tide in English. He's a professor at Queen Mary University in East London, and I'll mention his book later, but I've shamelessly plagiarised it for this talk and indeed many others. And what Webber says is that model I've just described concentrates rather too much on the sort of political and superstructural, the ideological factors, and neglects to look at the development of productive forces within those economies. So Webber talks about the disciplinary exigencies of capital accumulation. In other words, the way production is organised, the way relations of production, new class relations are formed, and so on, is a very important addition, if you like, that you have to add to that superstructural analysis, which I think is a valuable insight. Right, now let's turn now to the specific and consider how Venezuela fits into that analysis, and how we can understand, therefore, the profound crisis that the Maduro government finds itself in at the minute. And the first thing to say is that the redistributive model, the model of the welfare in the Chavista government, was accompanied by a massive level of popular consciousness and popular mobilisation. There were 3 absolutely key battles in that process. By the way, note the dates when we're talking about them. They're quite early in that process, and now, 10, 12, 15 years ago. So we're talking about early on in the process of the Chavez government. The first battle was the attempted coup against Chavez in 2002. I always recommend this, but if you haven't seen The Revolution Will Be Televised, the amazing documentary by 2 journalists from Ireland, RTE, on the attempted coup against Chavez, YouTube. It is a fantastic piece of there must be the luckiest 2 Irishmen in the world. They were in the presidential palace when the coup was launched against Chavez and stayed in it throughout the process of the right taking over and then being defeated by massive mobilisation. So during the coup, essentially that coup was defeated by the mass mobilisation of the barrios around Caracas, where people marched in their tens of thousands demanding the return of Chavez and defeating the insurrection of the right. Fairly soon afterwards, there was an attempt to oust Chavez by the bosses' strike. There was a lockout in the oil industry, where the right were quite prepared to sacrifice the economic welfare of Venezuela and all its people in order to remove Chavez. So the oil industry was shut down by a combination of the right activists and the corrupt union bureaucrats from the previous era. And again, it was defeated by the mobilisation, by the actions of the Venezuelan oil workers first and their working class allies. The following year, 2004, there was an attempt to oust Chavez constitutionally by recalling his election. And again, it was defeated among absolutely enormous levels of popular mobilisation, where the working class, in all its forms in Venezuela, fought the right and the bosses to an absolute standstill and beat them. The important thing to note is not only this was the highest level of mobilisation and resistance, but it was also the period of the highest level of creativity, of pushing at the boundaries of what was possible. So this is the point where you get the Bolivarian circles, the kind of supporters of Chavismo that were forming at grassroots level. It's the point where you talk about communal commandos, communal councils, where they were attempting to define and to explain and to involve new popular means of controlling the economy from below, managing their own lives and so on. There was the formation of an independent workers' movement through the UNT Union. All kinds of experiments with workers' control at the level of production in for example, Alcázar, the aluminium plant, the Sidor steel plant in the east of Venezuela, and various other places. So this was the moment really where the widest possibilities were available to be seen, and they were pushing, as I say, pushing the boundaries towards a process of serious confrontation and transformation of capitalism in Venezuela. Now, those movements over the last 10 years have increasingly become integrated into the Bolivarian state machine, the state machine set up by the Chavistas. They've in many cases become compromised, corrupted, sometimes repressed as well, and they've been shorn really of that potential ability for real social and political revolution. The PSUV, the United Socialist Party of Venezuela, which Chavez launched in 2006, and by the way included nearly all revolutionaries in Venezuela joined it, very few stayed outside it, but really has never developed into a party of mass participation and control from below. Rather, it's become a kind of transmission of orders from the top, and also a way of absorbing militants from the various organisations into the state machine and removing them therefore from the base where they were originally active. It was also strongly oriented, by the way, on electoral mobilisations, of which there were 14 elections in the period of Chavez's government, so there was plenty of stuff to mobilise around. Now, real change in Venezuela did come for the poor. We have to defend these gains, and we have to explain that they did happen. These are not illusory. There was real change in cash income, in access to health, education, literacy, housing, generally an access to better and more secure employment. So these gains are real. But as the production of, the earnings from oil production fell, they all came under massive threat. You have to remember that in Venezuela, the amount of income that oil contributes to the economy is 95%. Right? It is astounding. It's called the Dutch disease, a reliance on one commodity. And clearly, when the proceeds of this monoproduction fall, then the whole country and the whole political process comes completely under pressure. And it's quite clear that the possibility of improvement in life, both for the poor and the maintenance of profits for the bosses, cannot continue under these situations. Now, the economy in Venezuela is in dire trouble. I mean, I'll illustrate you with a few examples. Inflation, first of all, effectively inflation is out of control in Venezuela. This is very difficult to describe it in any other way. It's been variously estimated, but we are in the realm where figures are almost meaningless at the moment. So if you take the 2016 figures, the central bank's figure, which was undoubtedly a lie, was that the inflation stood at 274% in 2016. Ecoanalítica, which is a kind of independent economic think tank in Venezuela estimated the figure at 525%, right? And I think the most interesting of all is the Chavista government's own figure. You can get from this that in 2016 they increased the minimum wage by 454% to keep pace with inflation explicitly. So whatever number it is, it's got lots of three figures and the rest. At the moment, estimates are bonkers. Estimates are all over the place. But the estimated inflation at present is 800%. It is not possible to live a normal life and to sustain economic and political life in an economy with an 800% inflation rate. You're looking towards the Weimar Republic here. What that means, of course, above all else, is that living standards for the poor in Venezuela have fallen absolutely beyond recognition. There are chronic shortages of goods. To be blunt, there are times for most Venezuelan families when it is impossible to put food on the table at the moment. This is the shortages are the top concern of 80% of Venezuelans, right? Imported goods are a particularly controversial area. Massive amounts of food, for example, are imported, drugs, etc., are just a playground for all forms of swindling, money laundering, fraud, corruption. And there are myriad stories of just enormous scams going on. Unfortunately, the rich who are benefiting from this are not only the old ruling class and the private bosses, but there's also a massive number of corrupt public officials who either do their own deals or take big cuts on deals that are done by private companies. Again, impossible to estimate, but the estimate is that 60% of import transactions into Venezuela are fraudulent, right? The misiones, therefore, the projects that were set up to promote housing, education, health and so on, are drained of all form of resources at the minute. There are some terrible stories about Venezuelan hospitals where not only do the families have to provide their own drugs, but they have to provide even water to patients in hospitals at present. What Weber says, in sum, really, is that Venezuela has come up against what he calls the objective limits of the Bolivarian process. That it can go no further without challenging the system that is still in place. Chavez's own final analysis in the Plan de la Patria, which is sort of the blueprint, if you like, for the project going forward. Just before he died, so I think this would be 2013, he called for this. He said, "We need the radical suppression of the logic of capital and a continuing transition to socialism. For new forms of planning and production for the benefit of the people to emerge requires pulverising the bourgeois form of the state that is still reproducing itself through abominable old practices." Now, that project really has not moved forward under Maduro. What investment there has been in oil, for example, is on the terms of Gazprom, of Chevron, of Repsol and all the other foreign companies. There is a chronic lack of investment in state-owned industries. Planning is either inefficient or non-existent. The diversification of industry, which would have been needed already to reduce the dependence on oil, has just not happened. New prestige projects like sugar refining have never even got off the ground. Agriculture, the redistribution of land has either been stalled or even reversed in some cases. And above all else, the two features that you see most in the Venezuelan economy are inefficiency and corruption. And the beneficiaries, I'll repeat, are not simply the enemies that you'd expect, but they are also what Venezuelans now call the Boliburguesia, which is the Bolivarian ruling class, the level of corrupt public officials, relatives of public officials, etc., who benefit from the impoverishment of the Venezuelan poor. Class choices have had to be made, and the reaction of the Maduro government has generally been to compromise with the right. Which of course necessarily weakens both the economic position of Venezuelan workers and also the political mobilisation of them. And it is a conscious political choice, like austerity is a political choice in Europe, it is a political choice in Venezuela that has been made. Maduro's government seems to think that the Venezuelan right is split between two factions. One which is kind of respectable and constitutional, and the other which is insurrectionary and clearly out to subvert and destroy the government by overthrowing it. The problem is that this is not the case. Both sides of the Venezuelan right share far more than what divides them. None of them have any commitment to any form of democracy. They are all financed by the sons and by the families of the Venezuelan rich, by the private companies, by their allies abroad in the United States. They're all backed by large numbers of foreign involvement, from the United States, from the Republican Party. Obama's government declared Venezuela a threat to the United States. From Spain in particular, if you read El País in Venezuela, it's just packed with lies. But clearly, what we've got here is that the aim is the same. And the aim is to roll back the achievements and the benefits of Chavismo and to reimpose the authority of a violent, nasty ruling class that was in Venezuela and which caused the insurrection in the first place. Manuel Sutherland, who's a Venezuelan economist, I think hits the nail on the head here. He says, in sum, Chavismo under Maduro dreams of a reasonable and loving capitalist who clearly does not exist. With him it wants to negotiate, even though the normal action of these capitalists, that's to say the process of making profit, is the cause of the country's misery. The way to deal with the crisis of both the economy and the political offensive of the right can only be to resolve it decisively in the interest of labour, which means against the interests of capital. The majority of Venezuelan population, it seems to me, retain a large level, a surprisingly high level of loyalty, I think, to the Chavista government. Certainly, they retain an understanding of and a hatred of the Venezuelan ruling class. So that the slogan, they are not coming back, no volverán, is a common one on the Chavista demonstrations. We are not going back to the old order. But it's undoubtedly true, in my view, that the level of support for Chavismo in Venezuela is dropping because of the effects of the economic crisis. And you do find, for example, in the early demonstrations under Maduro, it was clear that these were manufactured in middle-class areas. Now you're beginning to hear substantial demonstrations and disturbances in areas which are not middle-class areas, which were and are the bedrock of Chavismo. There are still activists on the Venezuelan left, thousands of them, who mount a critique of what's gone on in the government and are committed to the building of popular power. Popular forces will not forget the gains they've made and they will not give up to the right. The question is whether the left can effect a change and lead a movement which can reassert the interests of the Venezuelan ruling class. I'll give you an example. This is Marea Socialista, which is a left current inside the PSUV, the Venezuelan ruling party. This is what they say. We're facing the classic counter-revolutionary schema. It consists of applying pressure on the government to implement anti-popular measures, and in so doing lose its social base. It will also deepen its exhausted image in front of the Bolivarian people. As a result, they'll be more open to the ousting of the government, whether that ousting is violent or soft. And that, I think, is exactly what's happening. Marea Socialista calls for a strategy which goes onto the offensive on the economy, which, for example, involves greater state control of commerce, of imports, intervention in the banking system, expropriation of the companies that are hoarding and speculating, and so on. Michael Roberts has a very similar project that he described was necessary, although he also points out that even if that took place, because of the context of Latin America, it would be very difficult to see a successful outcome to it unless other countries followed a similar pattern. Now the truth is, I'm sorry to say it, but there's no sign at least of anything like this happening at the moment. And of course there would be no point in it happening unless it involved a massive return to the popular mobilisations of 10 or 12 years ago when the streets were filled, the workplaces ground to a halt to fight the bosses, and there was a huge level of working class involvement across the country. Alongside bureaucratisation of the party, there's been an extraordinary level of corruption in the ruling party. There is a much enhanced role for the army, who now controls substantial sections of the Venezuelan economy. And the point is that this must be reversed and blown open. There has to be a return to mobilisation, a clear out and an accounting for what's happened inside it, inside the PSUV, and a return to the politics at the beginning of Chavismo of mass participation and militant involvement. Some see Maduro's call for a constituent assembly as an opportunity to reopen that process. Some of the left currents inside the PSUV are demanding that his call for a new Constituent Assembly, a reformation of the Constituent Assembly, be used precisely for that. The truth is, sadly, that there isn't any great sign of that protest being successful at present. What we've got coming to us, both in Venezuela and in the other countries, I think is this really. First of all, this is a period of much greater political instability, much less political consensus, and therefore a much higher level of class conflict in Latin America. There are elements of the popular movement, of working class organisation that are redeveloping. The relationship with the state has changed, and these have to have their combative capacity, that ability to push at the boundaries of what's possible, that vision of a different world which has to exist. Daniel Ben Said, French Marxist, calls a social revolution a process of imposing an alternative logic to the accumulation of capital, transcending the existing relations of production and opening up a new field of possibilities. Those possibilities did exist in Latin America 10 years ago even. Those possibilities can still exist. The key to what happens in Venezuela, and the key to what happens in the other pink-tide governments, is that the transformative possibilities have either got to expand and deepen, have got to expand or deepen, or surely things will go backwards. Now, that maintenance that I described of balance between change and reaction cannot remain in equilibrium. Either the working class has to go forward through its independent action and popular mobilisation, or we will get a period where they go back. That's the situation we're in Venezuela, and how that process works out will define the next period in Latin America.
And I think Andy raised a lot of issues there, and I'm sure a lot of us have lots to say. So just to say, how we're going to run the meeting is, if you wish to speak, ask a question, agree, disagree, please put your hand up. I will call people. I'll ask you to come to the front, and I will give you 3 minutes maximum to speak. And I will then, I found a use for the microphone. I will tap the microphone after, like this, after 2 minutes, so you'll need to be thinking about summing up your comments at that point. That is in order to allow as many people as possible to contribute to the discussion. Yes. And... yeah, if you want to use the microphone. Hang on a second. There you go.
Well, I think I completely agree with the comrade there. I think that in Venezuela we are facing a situation where it's revolution or counter-revolution. I mean, this is uncannily similar to Salvador Allende's situation in Chile in the 1970s. You have mass inflation, you have a popular leader who cannot use the state machinery to fully implement social change. And I think that is really the crux of Venezuela. What Chavez implemented is as left as you can go, using the state machinery of the bourgeois state. Now, Chavez, I have a lot of respect for him, but what he didn't do is that he didn't smash the state machinery, which meant inevitably it became dictatorial. It also, they tried to diversify the economy, but what ended up happening was that you have state officials running the situation. And there were some farmers that were speaking about what the Venezuelan government were, trying to implement, and they said, these people, they know nothing about agriculture. And so that is, the fact that it's from above, you're not getting professionals actually driving through the change. So that's, I think, a huge reason why the Bolivian revolution has failed is because it was from above, using all of the current bourgeoisie's ways of keeping power. Now, I think the situation in Venezuela is... Oh, sorry. But is dire. I think what needs to be done is that we need to immediately form independent workers' organisations separate from the government, and we need to overthrow the Maduro government and all of the counter-revolutionary elements with it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Comrade here, and just, thank you, come up. You're all right with that, Mike, or would you like to use it? Yeah. Just before you speak, there's a couple of people here who put your hands up and I didn't make a note of you, so if you think I haven't spotted you, please just put your hand up again. Yes, thank you, yes.
It was just a quick question really, where it was mentioned that 95% of the income in the economy was from oil, one resource, and I was wondering what people in the room or what yourself think about countries, especially in the Southern Hemisphere, which are reliant a lot on a single commodity. To what extent are they at the mercy of global commodity prices, regardless of the political structure you're able to implement, and then how you can combat that, whether there is anything beyond just diversification of your economy to combat that threat?
Thank you. And this comrade will be followed by someone in a blue t-shirt at the back I saw. And can people hear all right, by the way? Would you like to?
Can people hear me? Yeah, well, I would like to make a few kind of points on the contribution. Obviously, I think it's really, I'm coming from a Latin American point of view, or British Chilean, and I see it, as a kind of, at the moment, the situation is very bad in Venezuela. But what we have to take is kind of a class point of view on this, because at the moment, I think one of the key points, if the Bolivarian revolution is defeated or is said to fail, I think the only ones who will lose out will be the working class people. When Maduro is actually asking for the Asamblea Constituyente, the Constituent Assembly, I think he's relying upon all the working class people to come out and vote for him and to kind of defend that revolution. Obviously, I'm the first one to say about that there's been errors made and that the process has had many errors. However, what we have to concentrate on is also at what point actually are we going to stand with solidarity with Venezuela? Are we just going to kind of stand and say, because it's true what the comrade said at the back about that it's similar to Allende's government. It's very similar. And the thing is that if we're going to be kind of silent, I think we might think in the future, if Maduro's government, if the Bolivarian revolution is defeated, we might be, I think, kind of complicit in a situation, because the other point I would like to make also is that the opposition there in Venezuela is fascist, is racist. They burnt alive a black Chavista because they said, oh, you're a black Chavista, and they went and they burned him. That's a fascist, and obviously we're against fascism here, so we also have to be against fascism in Venezuela as well, and we have to be quite clear about that. So, and I think, at the moment there's an assault. There's also would like to mention if the comrade could actually answer about the sabotage of the right, because also that's played a major role in the actual kind of scarcity. So there's not so much food, the black market, because exactly the same happened with Allende. There was a huge black market and there wasn't food, and now we know that the CIA and the United States was backing that. So I think it's very important that we defend the revolutionary gains with a critical perspective, and we're quite clear that we're going to support the working class people of Venezuela, because if there's an intervention, if there's a military coup, there will be a massacre. There will be a massacre, and the only people who will lose out will be the working class people. And, And also to say, if the opposition get into power, they will pursue like a vicious policy of neoliberalism, of privatization, and they will destroy all of the gains of the revolutionary, like the free hospitals, free healthcare, all of the social housing. And that's what I would like to say, and to kind of say that it hasn't failed the project, because there's still much more to construct from that. Yeah.
T-shirt, yes, yourself.
Yeah, I think it's a very important issue, and it's very important to have these debates and to open up these spaces of dialogue, because if we just say there's two blocks, there's the fascists that are against Chavez, and otherwise there's the monolithic block that simply says Chavez or Maduro is the solution, I think we can't advance. Another example is Brazil, where there was the PT government over many years, Lula and then Dilma Rousseff, that was involved in corruption, was involved in political compromises with the right. For that reason, they lost support, they lost the majority in parliament, and so then the right, scandalous, corrupt, neoliberal right, launched impeachment of Dilma, totally hypocritically accusing her of corruption, and of course the people who did that are more corrupt than anybody in the world. I think of a few weeks ago, one of the ministers were found 500 kilos of cocaine being landed on his massive hacienda. So we need to say, how do we fight the right without pretending that this pink tide was actually doing everything right? Because if they're already losing, then we can't say, well, let's go back to that. No, because they were going down. So we need to find another alternative. One example in Venezuela that I think, of course, there is this horrible racist far-right, but there's also opposition. For example, there's a campaign very like Standing Rock in North America, in Orinoco, against a mega extraction project in indigenous lands. One of their leaders was recently killed. So what do we say about that? If you complain about that, then you're in bed with the right? No, we have to find a way of saying we are against the right, we need to fight the right, but not on the basis of submitting ourselves to Maduro and the bourgeoisie and whoever's leading the PSUV. So it's a question of how can we build from below? And here we're not going to build workers' committees, nor are we going to overthrow Maduro. I think from here solidarity has to mean fighting wherever we are and giving solidarity to the Venezuelan people and the Brazilian people against the right, but not unconditional support to their leaders who have brought us into this situation.
Yes, if you'd like to come to the front, and then there's a woman here, put your hand up if you'll be after him.
Do I have to stand and be on the thingy?
No, you don't. You can stand anyway.
Can I do Dave Allen, I just want to actually ask a little bit more about this. It does seem to me that the central point is the relationship between workers' struggles in Venezuela and the government, which I think the last speaker's actually covered quite nicely, so I won't go into it on there. But it did strike me when the Corbyn who spoke initially, he talked about the parallels with Chile, because one of the things with the Allende government is that they very much didn't see the strikes in Chile as being central to what was going on. In fact, one of the key aspects of the ruling class strategy was they split off the miners in a huge copper mine, away from the government. They got them to oppose the government if they struck against the government. So what I'm really interested in is that obviously in the Chavez period this would be much more likely. But I want to know what is the actual relationship really between the Bolivarian regime and workers' struggles. I'm actually also interested in how Chavez approached the question of strikes, even during the struggles against the coup. So I'd just like to know a bit more, because you talk about charismatic leader, but that seemed to me that was the whole thing, is that Chavez's strategy basically was just trust me. And you get these apocryphal stories about him having these meetings and saying, I've just been reading from Trotsky, so now I support permanent revolution. I think that's probably not true, but do you know what I mean? Yeah. Okay, thanks.
And after this speaker will be the person right at the front. Thank you.
I always had a very contradictory take on Chavez. In 1999, I moved to the US, and I was surrounded by Venezuelans, very middle-class Venezuelans, and I was reading the New York Times. The New York Times was like, oh, he's a dictator, he's awful, my God, he's repressing human rights. All my friends from Venezuela, very white, very middle-class, also Indio, like, oh my God, and he's talking about class hatred. So So, and then I was going out with this guy, and he's like, well, I don't know that much about Chavez, but what I know is that he's actually doing that to Washington. He's like, well, I have a lot of elements that I cannot really put together, but kind of instinctively I thought, well, Chavez sounds quite right, quite cool, right? Like for the first time in a long time I hear someone in Latin America saying, you know what, I'm gonna stand up to it and that's it. And then of course, you know, all we know, I completely agree with David what he's saying about we shouldn't, you know, just say, yeah, well, Maduro or fascism, and if we support Orinoco struggle, we are automatically fascist. So it's very difficult to reconcile those two points for me. So I want to know if you can.
And yes, after the speaker, yes, no. Yeah.
Yeah, let me start by saying I agree very much with the guy in the team T-shirt who said that if the Maduro government is overthrown by the right, it will be a defeat for the movement and it will be a reverse of all the gains of the Bolivarian process so far. It's not an outcome that we support. At the same time, we have to be clear that the movement from below should not allow itself to be limited by the Maduro government itself. This has been a fundamental issue going right back to the process of Chavismo when it emerged in 2002, 2003 as a dynamic revolutionary process from below. And I want to say something about the left's attitude to these experiments, because one of the problems with the left is there was never any balance sheet drawn. I remember 10, 15 years ago, enormous excitement about Chavismo, enormous celebration of Chavismo. Today no one talks about it. I remember 2 or 3 years ago, enormous enthusiasm for Syriza in Greece and Tsipras and so on. Today no one talks about Greece and Tsipras as the model. And we have to say, we have to learn from these processes if we're going to move forward. We are moving in Britain into our own period of massive social experiment in the shape of Corbynism. What can we learn from these other experiments that have taken place in Latin America and Europe and so on and so forth? And we said back in 2003, 2004, there were 2 limitations to the experiment taking place in Venezuela. The first was the extent to which it was prepared to encroach on the interests of capital. Now the reality is, if you look at the Venezuelan process, part of the reason it was able to be so successful was the incredibly inflated price of oil on global markets, which allowed Chavez's government to both satisfy the needs of the people at the bottom of society without encroaching on the wealth and privilege of those at the top of society to a very great extent. That was sustainable for a period of high oil prices. It's clearly no longer sustainable. Secondly, the question of the state. It's true that Chavez disrupted the workings of the Venezuelan state, but there's been a new Bolivarian state created, which has drawn in sections of the old ruling class who've jumped on the bandwagon in order to retain and bolster their own privilege. And the state apparatus remains deeply corrupt, a deeply top-down apparatus, an apparatus which can't take forward the revolution. Final point is this, that there are 2 souls to the Bolivarian process. There was popular mass initiative from below, but within that popular mass initiative, the role of the PSUV, the Socialist Party built by Chavez, was deeply contradictory. Was it a top-down initiative for channeling the will of Chavez and the people at the top of the Bolivarian state into the mass of population? Or was it a body born from below to drive forwards a revolution and begin to encroach upon capital and begin to disrupt and replace the Venezuelan state? That ambiguity was not fully resolved. And we have to say, in these processes, we have to have a mass socialist organisation, independent of the state, independent of the needs of capital, to drive the revolution forwards and drive it forwards onwards to socialism. Thank you.
In the chat shirt. Can I just say, I've got lots of people who still want to speak, and so can I ask, I'm going to give you 2 minutes from here on in to try and let everybody get a chance to speak.
Yeah, I understand with David. I agree with David. I understand what Ricky is saying, that we need to help, the Bolivarian revolution, but it's very difficult. If you just think of electoralism, when they vote for the presidential, even in France, you have to vote for one or for the other. And some people, the indigenous people in Ecuador, just reached the conclusion that it's better just to let people vote or people can abstain. Okay. One of the solutions, Andy. Well, thank you very much, Andy, for the talk. It was really good. One of the solutions Andy said is that we need mobilization. Well, the people from Venezuela are leaving because they are desperate. They cannot survive there. They are going to Ecuador. They are going all around South America, and they were the base, of Bolivarian revolution. I don't understand how Chavez, who has been in the government for so long, didn't speed the process of social changes. People reacted, supported him when they tried the coup d'etat, and the rich classes who were controlling the country, they reacted again. So that's the problem with the Bolivarian revolution. And then in Ecuador, for instance, even Lenin Moreno is just opening, the transparency, and people are becoming a bit aware of how the corruption was, think of other left and that's big companies, giving a lot of money to the people in the government. So about corruption, yesterday I talked to a Latino comrade after the talks in Marxism, and she said to me, well, corruption is all over Latin America, and I always have fun with Latino comrades, after a meal, because they get very, very emotional. Said you should put some people from the Scandinavian, just the vice president, in your country, and they said, well, you can do the same in Spain. So maybe Catalonia doesn't want to be independent. So corruption is really, really, deep in South America, but they have very good points. For instance, the petrol was very expensive, and they get a lot of money from the petrol. But at the same time, people from South America were sending money to the families. So even the petrol incomes were going up and down, and they receiving a lot of money from the families because they are very family-centered. So they need to know what are the potentialities and develop those potentialities. They have agriculture, tourism, so less corruption, more mobilization, and learn from themselves.
After this comment, there's someone right at the back with the red T-shirt. You had up your hand up. Yes, I have seen you, but you're next.
2 minutes, here goes. When Chavez got into power, I believe the price of oil was something like $8 or $9 a barrel. He went around the OPEC countries trying to force the price of oil up to $50. It was a bonus when it went up to 146, though, as Joseph said. He was able to satisfy both sides. Now it has gone down to $46 a barrel, which in terms of international exchange to buy means he got pretty much what he wanted, and he can still satisfy the bottom half of the country, but he can't satisfy the top. When I first went to Venezuela, I was being taken around the Maracaibo Lake, the oil-producing area, and I was saying, what the fuck is Halliburton doing here? And that's the sort of stuff that was never challenged by Chavez. So Halliburton were coming in to help run the oil industry at the same time as doing all sorts of nasty things in the Middle East. There were their activities there. Pesov. Chavez decided to form the Socialist Party in Venezuela, and overnight it had 6 million members. Now there's a way to start the SWPA, but it tells you whether it's bottom up or whether it's top down, and that's a problem that has continued for some time. A lot of the changes that took place were small-scale changes. When I was there, I saw some fantastic projects, women building housing, small-scale land reform, where people would take control over their own production. But there was never a challenge to the huge land tracts that there were in the south of Venezuela to take it over. So the right have always been able to maintain their position with pulling sugar, pulling coffee, making shortages happen in the supermarkets. Can you say a little bit more about Chavez and his idea about expanding things with Telesur and having a Latin American movement against America, which I think you hardly touched on? Allende, I don't think the army has yet moved. I think the army is still full of Chavistas. Without them moving, I think America is going to stay well clear of moving into Venezuela. God, I could go on. I won't now.
Person, yourself with the team T-shirt.
Yeah, a couple of good points about the workers, the bosses strike. Apparently, as they left, they cut all the wires to the computers. So what Chavez supporters did is just went to the university, got all the electronics students, and they got to rewire the computers up again. So that sort of thing. And then the sort of young Cuban doctors arriving on the barrios outside of Caracas. Freezing cold, you know, from Havana, but it gave them access to healthcare and clinics that they'd never experienced before. So those sort of things about the Chavista revolution, that's fantastic as far as we're concerned. I remember Chavez at the time was criticised for only nationalising half the oil industry. You know, this sort of thing like 49% or 59%, you know what they get up to. And he was criticised for that. But what Andy said at the beginning was 95% of your economy is based on oil, and with the price of a barrel of oil dropping from over $100 to less than $50, would it have mattered that much had they got all the oil industry? You know, the losses because of the loss in income of oil have just been fantastic. The comrade at the very beginning made a statement I thought was very interesting. Chavez probably went as left as he could within the bourgeois structure, you see. So it's no good just grabbing hold of the oil industry, is it? Really, you've got to grab hold of everything, the whole caboodle.
After this person, myself with the blue check cheese. Thank you.
In 2002, as Andy said, the right attempted to oust Chavez. And the working people of Venezuela took to the streets in their millions to defend him. If the right attempted a coup today, I don't think we would see something similar, or at least, you know, in the same scale. And we need to ask ourselves, why is that? Why is that? Working people whose living standards are deteriorating are opposing the government in some cases from a left-wing standpoint, or because they identify it as the one to blame for their living standards. And what happens if the left accepts the argument that, you know, anything but an unconditional support for the Venezuelan government means siding with the right? Well, what will happen is that those sectors of the working class will feel alienated and will look at the right as the only ones providing a platform for them to defend their interest. That's why what Maria Socialista is doing is brilliant, but unfortunately is not big enough. And this is a process that will deepen because the lack of resources of the Venezuelan government is not going to change in the near future. And as the right keeps growing, Maduro's government will resort to increasingly more and more repressive measures to hang on to power, and that will alienate more and more people. Unfortunately, I don't think we can't advocate for an overturn of his government, because at the moment the only ones with the capacity to do that are the right, and therefore they will be the only ones who benefit from it. And as Richie said, that it will be followed by an immediate clampdown on the groups and the resistance and all the parties that have carried out, you know, the progressive measures from the last few years. Two quick questions. Could you talk a bit longer about about, you know, the characteristics of the right-wing movement in Venezuela, and the fascist trend that are clearly developing, and also are young people in Venezuela more likely to support the right, those who didn't live under the previous regime?
Last two speakers, I'm really sorry, we have run out of time, so it's you and then you.
Just a question to Andy. I know there's a lot to sum up, and we could spend a long time talking here. But just I would like to know what drives the Spanish state obsession with Venezuela, and the fact that they hate it so much, and even, you know, it's all over the press, it's everywhere. We don't want this to become Venezuela. Is it because of the interest of the big Spanish companies in the country? Is this because of the affinity of the Bolivarian government with Podemos? what is it that they hate so much? I mean, I would like you to pick up on that. Thank you.
I think any government's going to be in trouble where they've got people who are hungry and suffering from malnutrition and queuing all day for foods and things. What's really interesting is what happens now, because we're almost a crunch point now, this crisis point, where the popular support for the Maduro government is falling. Part of the coalition, which was part of the Chavez government, was always the military. They were always part of that, and so far they've always been loyal to the Maduro government. Parts of that military, if the population is really starving and hungry, are going to be thinking about where the future lies and what they're going to do in the future. They've been part of that Chavista coalition, much in the same way that there is a tradition of left military governments in Latin America, in Peru, Nicaragua, etc. And that was part of Chavez's initial thinking. It'd be interesting to know what role the military are likely to play, whether that leads to some form of potential civil war, or whether that leads to some negotiated return of the right, which is probably, I think, the most likely scenario.
Okay, Andy, you have the task of summing up.
Let me start with Jeff Webber's book. The book's a collection of essays, really, rather than a book as such, with a kind of intro and a conclusion that tie them all together. But it is a really brilliant account of not only of Venezuela, particularly strong on Bolivia. It's got a very interesting chapter on Chile and the movement in 2012. It's got insights into Ecuador that are very important in the light of Lenin Moreno's election, etc. So if you read one book on Latin America this year, and you should, that's the book to read. Right, I'll do a few short ones. Inevitably, I'm going to miss some things out, but you can buy me a drink and I'll talk to you forever. It's not a problem. First of all, let's start with the Spanish state. It is obsessive. It's astounding if you read back Venezuela in the Spanish press. The press releases from the Spanish government, the Spanish Secret Service, all kinds of weird stuff. The Spanish bourgeoisie are absolutely obsessed with them. I don't think it's a very complex issue. The reason why the Spanish state is obsessed with Venezuela is because they hate workers. It's fairly simple. And the problem is Venezuela was, particularly in Spain, I think, more so than in Northern Europe, Venezuela was an example that people talked about all the time, There's a reason why all the leading cadre of Podemos focused and went to Venezuela, went to Ecuador, went to Bolivia. They all worked in it. It was a real important influence in the Spanish-speaking world, I think. And the bourgeoisie know what's coming to them if the idea of participatory democracy and workers' revolution from below starts to engage people and to spread it. It was that point where people were talking about socialism in the 21st century. But it is very, very, very notable. Jeff Webber points out that the whole of the capitalist press has got this amazing obsession with Venezuela. Who the hell ever heard about Venezuela in Britain? All of a sudden, it's got this dystopian vision of chaos and tragedy and terribleness that they want to throw at us. And they want to throw it at us because they know that at the moment their order is under threat, that people are questioning it. And it doesn't matter how we question it, the idea that a popular project, whether or not it's real, but calls itself socialism, can succeed, is a danger to the ruling class. And that's why it's both obsessive in Spain and in the British press, I think, on it as well. Do young people support, or are young people more likely to support Chavez? I think it's about class. It's very simple. It's very simple. There are key elements of the shock troops of the right who are young people. They call themselves students. What they actually mean is they are the students of the universities of the ruling class. There are two sorts of university in Venezuela. The ones that always existed to enrich the ruling class, send their children to the United States, put them in positions where they could exploit others. And then there are the other universities which were opened by Chavismo, which vastly extended the ambit of further education to much more working class people. And I think basically it's a fairly straightforward class split. The students of the ruling class are always on the street. They've been on the street for 90 days, more or less unbroken now. And they are key shock troops, as they were in the youth movement of Patria y Libertad in Chile, the fascist youth movement under Allende. It was the same sectors of students that were there. Someone was talking about Chavez, I think, talking about Chavez. I love Chavez. I mean, partly because he was bonkers. Yeah, he's just, he appeared to know no fear. That speech where he got on the podium at the UN after George Bush, and he gets up to the podium and says, I can still smell the sulphur. This is how world diplomacy should be conducted. And he also had this. Do you remember the mad program Allo Presidente, where he went on telly and basically it's like radio phoning, only visual, and it was completely crazy. And I've said this before, you just got to imagine Theresa May on a program. Wouldn't it be great? But the truth of the matter is, this was froth. You know, this was his impression. There was a reality to it as well, though. Chavez was not one of the white elite in Venezuela. He was not from the ruling class that are all blonde and, you know, and they despise the poor. And part of it is they despise the poor because they're not white enough. So when Chavez spoke, he spoke with an accent. I can't even remember where he comes from the middle of nowhere. Like, he spoke as an ordinary guy who'd come up through the ranks in the army. And therefore people did identify with him, and that's massively powerful. And I know what you mean. You know, all the time, you've got an admiration for these things. At the same time, you're thinking, hang on a minute, I've got to get political with this. I've got to keep my head together with this. And that's exactly the dilemma. And it's the same, the dilemma with the working class as well. Chavez would go and go, I've been reading Trotsky, I've been reading Gramsci. You think, how do you get all time for all this bloody reading? I can't read and I'm only a teacher, you know. You're the president and you think you've read all this sort of stuff. And he did have this rhetoric, but the truth of the matter is, what we need to look at is the real substantial relations in Venezuela. And people, by the way, the debate was brilliant. I mean, loads of really good contributions. Somebody asked about the working class. There was a break from the old CTV, the corrupt, bureaucratic, in the pocket of the bosses, union leadership and so on. But the UNT never really broke to being a mass workers' organisation. It was riven with conflict. There was all kind of bureaucratic formulations that got in it. But the truth of the matter is that when push came to shove, the Chavez government too acted against the interests of organised workers. They did do that. So we can't hide these things. Look, I need to move on really quickly. I want to make two final points. The activities of the right, again, the Venezuelan right, I know the right are always nasty, but the Venezuelan right are particularly nasty, vicious and violent. They were before Chavismo, and my God, if they get back in their terms, there will be a backlash to end all backlashes. It will be terrible. They will destroy the popular movements. They don't give a monkey's about the situation of Venezuelan ordinary people, and they will make their lives even more of a misery they are now. On top of the economic deprivation, there will be an appalling political backlash. And I'm sorry I can't go into further detail of it, which is why, comrades, we do not at the moment use the slogan, at least, we want to see the overthrow of the Maduro government. What we use is the slogan that says we want to defend the interests of the working class in all its forms in Venezuela. We want to see the gains and the victories of the Chavista period, however much they may have gone backwards and however much they may have been limited. We want to see those gains maintained and expanded. We want to see the process of political participation, of mobilisation, of workers, barrio dwellers, indigenous people, black people in the state, etc., taking power over their own lives, expanding. Therefore, we are 100% against the right and the overthrow of the Maduro government in those terms. We are 100% against the idea that a press conference where Donald Trump stands up and says, I am delighted to see the return of democracy in Venezuela, because it's bollocks. Because what that democracy means is exploitation of the poor. What that democracy means is oppression of women. It means the oppression of indigenous people and of races. That's what we have to be absolutely clear about. The critique is absolutely necessary. If we don't critique Chavismo, we do not go forward. But let's be clear where we stand. We know what side we're on when it comes to the difference between the right and the left, between the bosses and the working class. So let's be careful of the formulations. But it's extremely important that we learn from these processes. Let's be honest, this has been flipping exciting watching all this. This has opened possibilities to us. of what socialism will really look like in the 21st century. That's what Chavez claimed, and he was right. It is about that question. It's about questions of how we go forward. It's about questions of how we blow away capitalist society, how we ensure that working people have power over their own lives. And the key questions of tactics, what do you do about the state? Above all, I think, what do you do about a revolutionary party, are involved in those debates. So thank you for the contributions. Let's go forward on that basis.